Welcome to the next installment of the CAMTech webinar series. In our last webinar, we hosted Sarah Constantino and Larissa Parnell from Opt-Infusion. And Sarah and Larissa really gave a kind of a systematic approach of how to design a competitive pitch in their webinar series. And today we're really excited to host Alden Zecha from We Scale Impact. Alden is a founding partner at the boutique consulting firm We Scale Impact, to which he brings more than 30 years of broad-range executive expertise in operations, strategy, and finance, and a vast experience from work in more than 35 countries. He leads the firm's strategy and finance practices, developing pragmatic, actionable plans for clients and stimulating greater productivity by delivering more with fewer resources. Alden regularly speaks on health and entrepreneurship around the world, including at Harvard, MIT, the Saving Lives at Birth DevelopmentXChange, the Global Grand Challenges Summit, the Mobile Health Summit, and the White House, and he's been quoted in the Wall Street Journal and CFO Magazine. CAMTech first crossed paths with We Scale Impact this past May in Nairobi, Kenya for the Accelerating Saving Lives at Birth Accelerator Workshop, and we're really excited to have him give this how-to kind of scaling 101 for our network of innovators. So with that, I'm happy to pass it over to Alden.
Thanks, Nick. Really excited to be here today and glad to be sharing this content with the CAMTech network. I think that scaling is such an important topic for all entrepreneurs. You know, we all hear about it, and it's part of the goal for, I would say, every entrepreneur to scale, but it means different things to different people. So I just wanted to provide an overview today of what that might mean for a given enterprise so they can think about how scaling and that concept applies to them, and some pros and cons about scaling and some risks to be aware of as well. So let's get right into it here. As you can see here on the title page, my contact information is in the bottom right corner. I welcome listeners to contact me if they feel it'd be appropriate, or of course they can always contact the CAMTech team for more assistance as well. So what is scaling, right? Scaling in its most basic form is growth, and growth can be in terms of one or more directions. And I've listed a few here on this slide, such as volume, just more transactions, serving more patients and things of that sort, or it could be breadth, or it could be depth. And you know what I mean by breadth is, for example, in the healthcare space where most of us are working, it could mean additional services. So serving the same population, but potentially rolling out to them additional services beyond the core of whatever the venture has been doing so far. Or depth could be reaching a deeper. For example, it could be a primary care facility that initially started serving mothers and children and is now serving fathers and single adults as well. So a greater depth there in terms of the types of services being offered, a little bit of breadth, but more in terms of the range of patients being served. So some examples here, different types of scaling, and these aren't mutually exclusive. An organization can do one or more of these simultaneously, right? As I mentioned earlier here, right, these various directions, really looking at volume, breadth, and depth, and thinking about how an organization might best scale in terms of what is appropriate for it and its founders and its team, and also the values and culture that it espouses, right? So thinking about that as an organization moves forward. Why do we want to scale is an obvious question, right? So people always say, well, scaling is great. We should all scale. And then they say, and I want to scale in terms of volume or breadth or depth or all of the above or some combination. But why scale? I think there's this inherent belief that scale is good. And I would say in most cases that's true, but not in all cases. And so it's important to think about what are the rewards or benefits of scaling, right? So an obvious one, of course, is the first one here, greater impact, reaching more people or having more impact, whether that be, again, transactions, interactions, patients reach, scope and scale, right? The next one could be lowering unit costs. By scaling and driving more volume through a system, we often are able to lower unit costs. This is especially true in manufacturing or production, for example, medical devices. where if someone can sell more devices, it means they're making more devices, and typically then their unit cost will come down, right? So that's a benefit of scaling. Higher financial returns are an obvious one, where we can get more money by delivering more services, obviously more revenue in the door, and that's just straightforward. But other ones that people don't always think about are further innovation, right? By serving more people, by serving a broader range of patients or constituents, we can innovate more because we see more situations. We see more what are typically thought of as special cases, but often become more of the bulk of the norm. And so that idea of the more we serve, the smarter we get, in essence, is something that's the benefit of scaling as well. And then finally, increased recognition, right? More publicity, more PR, and increased recognition sometimes can lead to incremental funding, especially for nonprofits that might be dependent on grants or donations. So all of these can be great rewards from scaling and very positive in the upside of scaling, right? At the same time, there are challenges to scaling, right? It's not all rosy picture. It's not all wonderful and perfect. Scaling takes resources, often more money, more people, more time, as well as potentially more skills or expertise. There may be legal and regulatory challenges to scaling, especially if you're increasing the scope of services that you offer or if you're going cross-border. So as organizations scale internationally, they often run into situations where they have to face some legal or regulatory challenges. Doesn't mean you can't overcome them. It just means that you have to be aware of them and that you have to think through those before you may be able to scale to the extent that you'd like. Operational challenges is another one, where as we scale in an organization, because there are just more activities and a greater diversity of them, there are also more people involved. That can pose some operational challenges, especially, again, in the example where someone's expanding geographically and they may now have to manage part or the majority even of their team from a distance. And that's exacerbated by the last major bullet here, which is culture, right? As a team scales, culture changes. And I don't just mean international culture, culture from country to country or from ethnic group to ethnic group. It also has to do with company culture or organizational culture, because the customers, suppliers, partners, and all of those stakeholders will change. And there will be differences in how they think about your delivery of work, the impact you're doing, the services and value you offer. But of course, internally within the company, there are cultural changes, some of which are purely based on size. So as an organization goes from, say, 2 or 3 people to 10 people to 20 people to 50 to 100, maybe even 200 people, that internal culture will change. And that is important to understand and recognize. You won't be able to completely stop that change, nor should you, in my opinion. But you should plan for it, think about how you want to deal with that, and move forward appropriately. So all of these scaling challenges are things that an organization should think about proactively before you commit to scaling. Not that you shouldn't scale. That's not what I'm trying to say here, but rather be prepared, think it through, and think it through well. Right? So really, that's a quick overview to how we see scaling at We Scale Impact. We work with organizations around the world to help them scale, whether they be solo entrepreneurs trying to look to really launch their organization and move forward, or established organizations that are, have been around for decades even, looking to think about how to optimize their operations and to move forward more effectively and efficiently with fewer and fewer resources. So that's a quick overview today, Nick. Hopefully that helps the CAMTech audience, and I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Great. Alden, thanks so much. I think that this talk will really resonate with the innovators in our network and the mentors and investors who are working with these solutions in CAMTech's pipeline. And I think that during your presentation you mentioned culture, both when you were talking about scaling directions and some of the challenges, and that's something that's really interesting to CAMTech's network, because we're based in Boston but are also partnering with innovators in India and Uganda. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how innovators in these three locations might kind of face similar successes and challenges in scaling in high-income countries, but also in low and middle-income countries.
Sure. Well, the economic differences are obvious in terms of what's available in those marketplaces, and that's both in terms of revenue or returns, but also in terms of costs. Things are less expensive generally when available in the emerging markets, such as Uganda and India versus the United States, but not everything will be available necessarily, right? There are certain things that only high resource settings may have available to them, whether that be equipment or particular skill sets and people who have those skill sets. So that's one thing to think about. But as far as similarities go, I think if we think about these challenges that are on the screen right now, these are similar regardless of what market we're in, right? The numbers may be different, for example, costs in terms of money, but to scale in any of the markets that you mentioned, one needs money and one needs those people and those time and those additional resources, right? I think that often the entrepreneur that's in the emerging market might think, oh, it's so much easier to do certain things in the developed markets like the US or the EU. And that's often true, but not always the case. There are things that are actually much harder, especially for that second bullet, legal and regulatory, right? There are many more legal regulatory restrictions in place in the United States, in healthcare especially, than there are in India or Uganda. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't have any legal regulatory challenges in India and Uganda. Of course you do, but they're different and they tend to be a little bit more straightforward. They may be more bureaucratic. It may take just as long to move through those legal regulatory hurdles, but they may not be as technically challenging. So I think that's something to think about. And then as your entrepreneurs, as the CAMTech members, think about expanding beyond their home countries, potentially to other countries within the CAMTech network, I think it's important to really understand that the people you're working with will come from a different culture and a different mindset. What they think about the world, their aspirations, their constraints will be very different. And so one needs to adapt our own thinking to work in those different marketplaces, even though the product or the service may retain its core functions and in fact may be identical. The way people think about it and potentially the way people use it because of cultural influences will be very different or can be very different.
When you were talking about scaling challenges earlier, you also mentioned preparation, and a lot of the teams and innovators and solutions in CAMTech's network are very early stage and just past the ideation phase in terms of moving towards commercialization and patient impact. And I'm wondering what advice you have to innovators in terms of what they can start to prepare for at early stages of development for scaling.
Sure. So one of the things I advise organizations is to think about and plan for the future, but act for today. And what I mean by that when I give that advice is think about your future scale, where you'd like to get to, whether that be nationwide in terms of geography or international, whether that be serving an entire population's healthcare needs versus starting maybe with just one type of need. So that's a breadth and depth type question, or scaling. Regardless of what that is, think about where you want to go. Have that vision. And I think most entrepreneurs do have that vision, that aspect of that goal. And then think about what are you going to need when you get there. Not necessarily what you need to get there, that's also important, but also what are you going to need when you get there. For example, you might think, well, I'm going to need 10 clinics, or I'm going to need 500 employees and staff running those clinics. And that's fine. And then design around that, but implement for today. And so what I mean by that is, as you think about, in my hypothetical example, 10 clinics and 500 employees, make sure that you're not going to be designing human resource policies regarding hiring, firing, leave, benefits, and things of that sort that will cause trouble when you try and get to 500 employees. Now, that doesn't mean you need to put all those benefits and those policies in place today when you're one or two people and you're just getting out of the ideation stage. But you don't want to put in place anything that's going to block you from getting to that future. So that's what I mean by think about tomorrow and potentially design for it, but act for today. Only put in place what you really need now, so long as it won't block that future growth, that future vision that you have. That's part of the preparation and planning. So that as you scale, as you grow, you already know that you thought through some of these things that you're going to need and want, and that you haven't done anything that's going to block you from achieving that. You'll still need to lay more groundwork and get things done in order to reach that scale, of course. But at least you won't have to undo things that have kind of trapped you in a smaller scale. But you'll have that opportunity to expand more quickly.
Fantastic. Alden, thank you so much again for taking the time to, present for this next CAMTech webinar series. It was really great to have you. And our next step is to really share this with CAMTech's network on the CAMTech Innovation Platform. And I know you've put your email address here, and we hope that our audience watching this will reach out to CAMTech or We Scale Impact with any questions. And we're happy to stay in touch. So thank you so much again.
Thanks, Nick. Really enjoyed it today, and I welcome being contacted by any of the CAMTech network, or obviously having teams contact you directly, and then you can forward things to me.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Bye.